Welcome to Life Expansion After 50. Today's episode number 52. I title this episode Neuroplasticity is Your Friend. When you understand neuroplasticity and learn to access it to create the conditions in your life that are aligned with your vision, it changes things. What I mean by that is by the time we're 50 years old, 60, 70, we've seen a lot, right? We've given it our best shot. We've had the celebrations. We've had the disappointments. For most of us by age 35, 95% of our lives are run by habit, and that's pretty well accepted. And even though we've done different things, we've lived out a lot of those same patterns. So when people start thinking about a phase 2, life after retirement, or what I call life expansion, and I talk about it as a phase 2, not so much as retirement, but as what are we going to do now that we've done the quote unquote career thing? Think about it like this. How many of us have dreams from our teens that we never fulfilled? How many have been searching for our purpose? It's still out there in front of us somewhere. Now, the purpose is an interesting topic because for many people, they never really get it defined. They believe it has to be this thing that clearly defined, spelled out, very tangible. The reality is, it's probably not going to be much more than directional until you actually start taking steps towards it and make some progress. Once you make that progress, then it starts to get clearer and clearer. But in the beginning, it's directional. And if you talk to people about their purpose, what they think it is at 20, 25, oddly enough, it's the same at 50. And if they hadn't worked on it, it lacks as much this definition as it did 30 years earlier. So my point is, get started. And it's never too late. It's never too early either, but it's never too late. Get started on your purpose, lean into it, start making some decisions around it, and then you'll start to see life expansion differently. Without that backdrop, without looking at it as purpose, it will seem like, what are we talking about? More work? Why would I want to do that? The other reality is, we've all heard this, that people who are on their deathbed, they don't wish they worked more. They wish they spent more time on relationships, more time on purpose. And purpose does tie into relationships because a lot of it has to do with contribution. So if nothing else, getting to that point where you're not having regrets. And that's the way I look at it. Life expansion is to make sure that you're leaving this place with no regrets when that time comes. Now, in talking about purpose, I also want to connect the dots to self-actualization. Self-actualization, Maslow's hierarchy of needs, the physiological needs, then the safety needs, then the love needs, and the esteem needs. It's sort of natural. If you were dropped on a deserted island, that's the first thing you'd do, right? You'd take care of your food and shelter and make sure you have some weapons to fend off the wild animals. And then, at that point, the love is self-love. If you're on an island by yourself, it's self-love. And that's a point I think people miss. They get stuck trying to be complete when they don't realize that it's about being complete. So my point is, you set the rules for each of those levels. You set the rules for when your love need is met. You set the rules for when esteem is met. And so you don't have to wait for something that happens out there for your self-actualization. It's something that you can start working on as soon as you decide it's time. And self-actualization and purpose are interlinked because purpose provides the direction and the meaning that's necessary for individuals to fully realize their potential and achieve personal fulfillment. Now, the same way a person can spend hours upon hours when involved in a hobby or passion, a similar experience occurs with purpose and self-actualization. You recognize that the time passes, you get into that flow state because you're working on something that's important. And when you're truly working on purpose, you could do that without getting paid. People who are involved in startups, they literally are doing that work time often without getting paid for years because it has to do with their purpose. They're tied into it. Well, you can do that. I'm not saying a startup, but that might be your answer. But you can do that same thing working on your purpose. What's interesting to you if you were going to be an activist? What hobby have you left that you want to get back to? What are some childhood dreams that you always had out there that you want to pursue? Whatever it is, with the internet and social media, it's easier to get connected with those kinds of things and those subcultures. There's really no excuse to not do it. And again, when we're talking about life expansion, we're not necessarily talking about work. It could be, because purpose and contribution could be like work, but it doesn't have to be. For people who volunteer, whatever that volunteering is, it may not feel like work to you. It's something that you look forward to. It's networking. You're out there with people. Now, yes, you are doing something, and yes, they are relying on you, but the relationships that come out of it, the satisfaction, the fulfillment that comes out of it, it's not the same as when you leave a day of work. I want to talk about willpower, and there's a challenge with it because it does wane throughout the day, and it also wanes with our age. As we get older, our energy drops, we have more distractions going on, and all those things impact willpower, as does the less heart rate variability we have, the less willpower we have. So there's a correlation there as well. And then there's this other thing that shows up. It's they call it I don't want power. So you have willpower. And if you go back to thinking like in your teens, you had probably a lot of willpower, you applied it to discipline, whatever it was that you were working on, you just muscled through it. By the late 20s, it seemed like the willpower didn't always work. It didn't always come through. Some of you may have been let down in your 20s where you were going after it with willpower, but it didn't really come through for you. There's a brain development answer that is related to that. From 19 to about 27, our prefrontal cortex is becoming fully developed. And to put it in perspective, it's a big chunk of our brain. We have 100 billion neurons throughout our brain and nervous system. Most of those are in the brain, 86 billion and then 14 billion in the nervous system. 20 billion of those neurons are said to be in the prefrontal cortex. It's a quarter of our brain. If you think about the brain being 86 billion and 20 billion are in the prefrontal cortex. In the prefrontal cortex, when they look at self-control mechanism, the part of the brain that lights up is in the prefrontal cortex. So one can then further surmise that we didn't really have a strong self-control mechanism in our teens. The challenge with the self-control mechanism, let's say that we said something like, I'm never going to sell anything, I don't like selling. And let's say we made that statement in our teens or early 20s. Now the prefrontal cortex forms, and I like to think about it as forming around our conditioning. It's essentially operationalizing our conditioning for our life. And that conditioning is in there now because you said it with so much force and energy and emotion. Maybe you said it multiple times, getting the repetition that I don't want to sell. And that goes in the same way as I don't want to touch a hot stove. Not exactly, but you get the point. So this self-control, the same self-control that keeps you from touching the hot stove is now working to keep you from, quote unquote, going into a position where you're selling. Fast forward, you're in a situation and you're required to sell as part of your job, and you don't like selling, and it's always been resistance. It's always a challenge for you. That's an example of the I don't want power. The I don't want power is actually the self-control mechanism, which is there to help you, but it's kicking in because of this conditioning. And that's why I want to talk about this next part of it, which is the conditioning. And as I said earlier, 95% of our lives is run by habit. That's pretty well accepted. But that conditioning is largely from a world that existed 40 years ago. Here's why. From 0 to 7, the majority of our conditioning happens. It's a download. The kids don't have to work for it. It just happens. And it made sense in hunter-gatherer time. First of all, it's probably, in the early days, there's no language. So how does the person learn everything that they need to learn? It says download. They watch and they do. If you have children of your own, you probably notice that they have many of your mannerisms. They pick those up, and maybe even you watching your parents, you can see that you hold your some of your postures are the same, the facial expressions, those are the same, because this download happens from 0 to 7. It's like 0 to 2, it's in the theta state, child's brain, and then from 3 to 7 or so, it's in the alpha state. But essentially, it's like being hypnotized. Everything just goes right in. Here's the thing, though. That conditioning is from over 40 years ago. It's a very different world, especially when you think about technology, and now we have artificial intelligence and the globalization. Very, very different, especially for boomers and Xers who grew up with no real technology the way we know it today around us. I mean, households didn't even have computers in those early years. The other thing is that conditioning was built around the objective that it's going to make sure that you survive long enough to procreate. So there's two things that are disconnected. One, it's from a pre-technology world, and the other thing, it's based on surviving long enough to procreate. And then what? What happens after that? And that's where we get into this 95% of our lives are run by habit. We sort of abdicate our responsibility and just turn it over to the unconscious to do the work for us. So I titled it Neuroplasticity is Our Friend. The reason is because neuroplasticity says the brain we are born with does not have to be the brain we die with. We can change our conditioning. So the same way that 0 to 7 conditioning was set for us, and it's based on over 40 years ago, and it was based on a different model or paradigm, which was to keep you alive long enough to procreate. Well, now, if you're thinking about a phase 2 and designing your life, you can recreate your conditioning to match and be aligned with the design. I like to think that after you do that, you're still going to be running your life 95% by habit, but there'll be habits that work for you. And that way, the automaticity of the unconscious is working for you. So I mentioned earlier about willpower and how the I don't want power can kick in, and it feels like it's self-sabotage. It's not self-sabotage, it's just misaligned conditioning that we've got to figure out. And the reason I say it's not self-sabotage is because it's not like you're consciously deciding to sabotage yourself. It's unconscious conditioning that's happening. We've got to figure out where the limiting beliefs are. We have to figure out where the counterproductive associations are, and then you neutralize those associations. You neutralize them by replacing them with others. So all those associations, if you consider what conditioning is from the past. Associations are from the past, which means that most of your conditioning is not going to be optimized for you moving into the future. This conditioning resides in you've heard neural pathways. We've got 100 billion neurons, as I've mentioned. They're connected with synapse, the neurotransmitter. Each of those neurons is connected with thousands of other neurons. So there's a lot going on in there. With deep practice and people struggling on the edge of ability, habits that are played out over and over and over, associations that are played out over and over and over, they get wrapped with myelin. Myelin improves the speed and the strength and the accuracy and the precision of those impulses going through the neurons, and now you have a strong habit. This is why habits are hard to break, because they're made to stay. Those habits you build up from 0 to 7 in a hunter-gatherer environment, they're going to keep you alive. They're going to help you survive when you're faced with a Serengeti tiger. It makes sense that they're not going to change. But in this world we don't have the tigers, right? We have other threats, but seldom do they get to the level of a tiger. And there's a way to, even though they're wrapped with myelin, you can still change those habits. You don't change them. What you do is you replace them. You lay in a new neural pathway. The neurotransmitter that's connected that old pathway dries up. So the more you can do it at the cue level, in other words, take the same cue but build a new neural pathway for it, that cue no longer fires the old neural pathway. If you think about that old neural pathway, you're thinking about it. That's why they say if you try to suppress an emotion, it grows, right? It gets larger and larger because you're thinking about it. You're putting energy into it. But when you change it at the cue level, that cue doesn't kick off that neural impulse. It kicks off another one. And that new impulse, that new association is the one that you're building for yourself, for your life design. And that's how you get the automaticity working for you. The book Limitless by Jim Quick, that's Kwik, does a good job of explaining neuroplasticity. I like Angela Duckworth's book Grit, which talks about deep practice and how you can actually change your brain using this deep practice. And also Talent Code by Dan Coyle gets into the myelin. And once you understand how the myelin wrapping works, it gives you a picture of what you need to do to change it. We're talking months, not years. One of the challenges that people run into when we go after the neuroplasticity is the unconscious has been in charge for so long, so it's very difficult for this to make sense. Once you get the conscious mind back in charge, then things get easier. And as a matter of fact, it makes it easier to change habits. Once you get that conscious mind back in charge, you can change a habit just with awareness, just by being aware that me saying I don't want to sell is no longer aligned with my life design. And that's sometimes all it takes. Sometimes it takes more than that. But when you have the conscious mind in charge, because the unconscious was not supposed to be in charge, it's running the show because it's efficient, it's fast, it can process data at an amazing rate. The conscious mind is a lot slower. But the conscious mind is where your decisions and intentions come from. And it's the decisions and intentions that lead you to your purpose, that enable you to self-actualize. The unconscious is about the actions and behaviors. And this is why I tell people, when you say, I can't do that, you have to be careful, because that it may not be you. It may be you just don't have the behaviors. You may just not have the neural pathways for it. So somebody says, yes, I want to sell, but I just can't do it. It's just who I am. That just who I am, that's the behaviors. So you want to start making that distinction between what are your intentions and then what are your habits, and realize that there's a difference there, and start leaning into seeing that difference, because that's where the neuroplasticity comes in. You can start replacing some of those habits with the ones that work for you. Once you do that, and once you start having the habits aligned with your life design, you'll start to find that your response to situations is more reliable, more aligned with your intentions. And that's a big part of why people have thrown up their hands, right? They said, I don't want to do this anymore. It's no longer reliable. They get disappointed. They try so hard, but it doesn't work out. But it's because they've got habits that are going in a different direction. when you can see that, and you can see that you can change those habits to be aligned, and now that same automaticity that kept you from achieving your goals, it's now working to help you achieve your goals. Next week, I'll talk about the 6 human needs, because I think that's going to be part of this. It's why some of the conditioning is what it is. It's why some of our experiences have been what they are. And the 6 human needs, it does get into life expansion from the purpose and self-actualization point of view. You can also use that as a way to lean into your purpose. All right? We'll see you next week.